Learn from nature. A beautiful flower blooming deep in a valley is never praised for its beauty. It simply blooms, withers, bears fruit, and passes life on. As animals in the forest take only what they need to live. As in the end they too are eaten and life continues. Yet I long to achieve something worthy of praise. I desire even what I do not need, as I want to leave proof that I was here. When I grow tired of these desires, I walk into nature. There are mountains, rivers, trees, and flowers. There are birds, insects, fish, and animals. In a world that has existed for hundreds of years, I feel the brevity of my life and choose to live with gratitude. There is a valley I have never seen with my own eyes, and yet I know it as clearly as I know the palm of my own hand. It lies low between two ridges of stone that have forgotten the names men once gave them. Mist gathers there in the early hours and does not lift until the sun has climbed high enough to reach down into the cleft of the earth. No path leads to it. No traveler has carved his initials into the bark of its trees, and no shepherd has ever driven his flock across its narrow floor. It is in every sense that matters unclaimed, and somewhere in that unclaimed hollow, a single flower opens its petals to a morning that no one is awake to witness. So I want you to sit with that image for a moment before we move any further. Not a garden flower, so tended and admired, cut at its peak and placed in a vase where it might catch the light of a window. Not a flower photographed for its color or bred for a competition, or planted along a walkway so that people might pause and say something kind about it. A flower with no audience at all. Its bloom is not an event. It is not scheduled, not anticipated, not later described to friends over dinner. The petals unfurl the way a hand unclenches in sleep, without decision, without applause, without even the flower's own awareness that anything remarkable has occurred. And here is the strange, a quiet truth I want to press gently into your chest. That flower is not lesser for having no witness. It does not bloom less fully because no one calls it beautiful. Its beauty is not a performance that requires a spectator to become real. It simply is. It's in the fullest sense that being can mean, and then, in time, it is not. The same petals that opened without ceremony will close without mourning. They will brown at the edges, curl inward, fall to the dark soil below, and become the very thing that feeds the roots from which another flower, next season, will rise. There is no tragedy in this, though we are trained by our own hunger for meaning to look for one. The flower does not experience its withering as a loss of status. It's because it never held any status to begin with. It held only its own brief unfolding, and then it held the work of returning what it had borrowed. I think of this valley often, more often than I think of the rooms I have actually stood in. Because I recognize something in that flower that I struggle to recognize in myself. I have wanted, for as long as I can remember, to be seen. Not simply to exist, but to exist visibly. To exist in a way that leaves a mark on the account other people keep of the world. When I do something well, some small ember in me leans toward the door, waiting for someone to walk in and notice. When I do something quietly, unwitnessed, some part of me feels it does not fully count, as though an accomplishment without an audience is only half completed, a sentence without its final word. This is not a flaw I am confessing to you in shame. It is simply the shape of the hunger that most of us carry. Inherited from somewhere so far back, we cannot trace its origin. Passed down like the color of our eyes. But the flower in the valley carries no such hunger, and this is why I return to it again and again. It's the way a person returns to a well when their own water has run thin. It teaches without speaking. It blooms because the season has arrived and the conditions are right and the sap has risen through. The stem and none of these reasons requires a witness in order to be sufficient. Its whole existence is a kind of answer to a question I did not know I was asking, which is whether a life can be complete without being recorded. Consider how the flower spends no energy at all defending its right to bloom. It does not compare itself to the flower on the next ridge. It does not wonder whether its color is fashionable this year. It does not resent the moss for growing so easily in the shade, while it must fight for its patch of the sun. Then it spends everything it has on the single task in front of it, which is to become, as fully as it can, exactly what it already is. There is an economy to this that I find almost unbearably instructive. We spend so much of our own brief allotment of days on activities that have nothing to do with becoming and everything to do with being seen becoming. We narrate our efforts before we have finished them. We polish the telling of a thing until the telling outweighs the thing itself. And all the while, in valleys we will never visit, flowers we will never name are completing the entire arc of a life. A bloom to fruit to seed to soil, without a single one of these detours. I do not say this to shame you or to shame myself for wanting to be known. It is a real hunger, and pretending it does not exist has never once made it quiet down. But I do think there is something worth carrying away from that unseen bloom. Something I would like to set down beside you now, gently, is the way you might set down a stone you found on a walk and want to keep without quite knowing why. The worth of a life is not proven by the number of eyes that fall upon it. A thing can be whole and finished and entirely successful in its own quiet terms, without a single witness to confirm that it happened at all. This is difficult for us to believe, because we are creatures who learned early that our cries were answered by attention, that we were fed and held and soothed because someone was watching and someone came. So it is no fault of ours that we ache for eyes upon our work. But the flower in the valley offers a different foundation, one built not on being observed, but on being complete in oneself. I picture it sometimes at the exact moment of its fullest bloom, hours before anyone would think to call it beautiful, even if they were standing beside it. The petals are open all the ways, trembling slightly with the small movements of insects that come and go without any interest in aesthetics, only in the practical matter of nectar. The color is as vivid as it will ever be, and nothing at all is watching. Yet the flower does not dim itself in response to this absence. It does not bloom halfway because no one is there to appreciate the full display. It gives everything, every time, regardless of audience. Because giving everything is simply what it means to be alive in the particular way a flower is alive. I return to this valley in my mind whenever the old hunger rises in me. Whenever I catch myself hoping that someone notices what I have quietly built. I do not always succeed in setting the hunger down, but I have learned to at least recognize it when it arrives. To greet it the way you might greet a familiar guest who visits too often and stays too long. And to remember in the same breath that somewhere a flower is opening in the dark, needing nothing from me or from anyone, simply becoming what it already is. That is where this begins. Not with a lesson delivered from a mountaintop, but with a small, unwitnessed bloom in a valley that has no name on any map. And the strange ache I feel when I imagine it opening without me there to see. In the forest that borders that same nameless valley, there moves a fox who has never once considered the question of enough. A carelessness has nothing to do with this, nor has hunger made her reckless. The question itself, the one that keeps so many of us awake long after the house has gone quiet, simply does not exist for her at all. She hunts when her body tells her to hunt, and she stops when her body tells her to stop. Between these two signals, there is no negotiation, no second helping taken simply because it was available, no store laid up beyond what the den can hold. A single hair caught at dusk is not a triumph to be repeated for its own sake the following night if her stomach is already full. A second hair may pass through the clearing untouched, watched with the same flat attention given to falling leaves. Her den receives her again with nothing more than what she required. Years of this pattern have passed before these eyes, though watched is the wrong word, since most of it has only ever been imagined. The way a person imagines the inside of a house they have only seen from the street. Something in it remains true in its essence. Because every creature untouched by our particular species carries this same quiet arithmetic. Only what closes the gap between hunger and its absence is taken, and the rest is left for whatever comes after. There is no vault in the forest. No creature buries far more than it could ever eat simply because abundance has become confused somewhere along the way with safety. The squirrel who hides acorns against the coming winter is not an exception to this, though it might look like one at first glance. Only as many acorns are hidden as the season will actually require, guided by an instinct so precise it needs no examination, no defense. Many of the ones she forgets become, in turn, the very trees that will feed some other creatures winter 100 years from now. Even her forgetting is a kind of giving. A lesson seems buried in this that has nothing to do with virtue and everything to do with relief. Virtue implies a choice, after all, a moment of restraint in the face of temptation, a small heroic act of saying no to more, but the fox is not restraining herself. Temptation, in fact, never arrives for her in the first place, and this absence of temptation is not a discipline she has cultivated, but a peace she was born into. And most of us were born into that same peace as well, before the world taught us otherwise. Somewhere between infancy and adulthood, the want for more than hunger requires is learned. And once that lesson is learned, it is nearly impossible to unlearn completely. Shame does not seem to be the forest's intention in showing us this. Patience, without any urgency at all, seems closer to what it offers. A quiet demonstration of what it might feel like to set the extra portion down. And then there is the second half of this same forest arithmetic, the half that is far harder to sit with. The fox herself will one day be taken, perhaps by a larger predator whose hunger she cannot outrun. Perhaps by illness or age, or the particular cruelty of a winter that arrives before the den is fully prepared. Her body, which spent its whole life taking only what it needed, will in the end become exactly that for something else, food for beetles, nutrients for soil, the raw material from which grass will draw its green the following spring. No funeral occurs in the forest. No marker is placed to note where she fell. No ceremony arrives to mark the transfer of her body back into the general economy of the living woe. And yet nothing about her life is wasted by this ending. The absence of ceremony does not diminish the completeness of what came before it. This thought circles like water circling a drain slowly, and then faster, and then all at once falling through to somewhere it cannot be followed. Because if the fox's death means only continuation, only the passing of her substance into new forms of life, then perhaps a human death means the same. However much one might wish for it to mean something more distinguished. A comfort does not arrive with this thought every time, and there is no pretending otherwise. Some nights it arrives like grief, but other nights, and these nights grow more frequent the longer this example is sat with. It arrives instead like relief, the same relief the fox must feel, if a fox can feel such a thing. When she finally stops running and simply becomes part of the ground she once ran across. Honesty is owed here about the distance between this understanding and the days actually lived, because it would be dishonest to pretend the gap has closed. Things have been wanted that were not needed. A title to sit beside a name has been wanted. A number rising on a screen. A mention in a room where presence was never felt proof, is in whatever form it might take. Is that a particular arrangement of days amounted to something the world would bother to record. This wanting is not new to our species, and it is not, perhaps, entirely a flaw either, since it is the same wanting that once pushed us out of caves and across oceans and into the coldest corners of the earth just to see what was there. But the fox does not carry this wanting, and the flower in the valley does not carry it either. A suspicion has grown over time that the wanting itself is the price paid for a mind sophisticated enough to imagine a future no longer exists. An animal that cannot picture its own absence has no reason to build monuments against it. Our absence can be pictured with terrible clarity, and so there is building and hoarding, and striving and shouting into rooms and screens and pages, hoping that some fragment of noise will outlast the silence known to be coming. A foolishness does not seem the right word for this hoping. Exhaustion seems closer, and somewhere underneath the exhaustion a quieter self remains, one that remembers faintly what it might feel like to want only what closes the gap between hunger and its absence. A stream runs along the eastern edge of that same forest, shallow enough in most seasons to cross without wetting the knee. More than once, its edge has offered a place to stand and try to understand what it is doing. It is not trying to reach the sea, though it will eventually arrive there. It is not measuring its progress against the stream on the far side of the ridge, and it does not slow down out of modesty when it passes through a stretch of forest more beautiful than the last. It simply moves at the pace the land allows, taking the shape of whatever ground it finds itself upon, neither hurried nor delayed by any opinion about its own significance. When it reaches a stone too large to move, it does not fight the stone around it patiently. It goes instead, and in doing so it carves over centuries a curve into the landscape that no map could have predicted in advance. Something in this patient going around has needed to be learned for a very long time. Something about how the obstacles that feel in the moment like personal insults, are in fact simply features of the terrain, no more meaningful than a stone in a stream, and no more worth resenting. The water does not resent the stones. It simply finds the path available to it and continues. The distance between the self and these teachers, the fox, the flower, the stream, the forgotten acorn becoming an oak, cannot be fully closed. Not at least by someone raised among mirrors and ledgers, and the quiet daily pressure to prove that the hours have been well spent. But something has begun to shift in the noticing. The moment when the old hunger rises, the desire for more than the gap requires, the wish to leave some mark that outlasts the marking, and in the noticing, that hunger comes to be held a little more loosely than before. The way a hot stone might be held just long enough to feel its warmth before being set back down on the ground where it was found. This is not mastery. It is only attention paid again and again. Patiently, the way the stream pays attention to the stone it must go around. And so the forest calls for return, not because anything there has been solved, but because it keeps offering the same lesson in a slightly different shape each time. A patient with a slowness that very few people manage to meet with such patience, and certainly with a patience rarely offered to the self. So weariness arrives sometimes in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, without warning, without any particular event to explain its arrival. It settles first in the shoulders, then behind the eyes, and only later does it become clear what it actually is. Not fatigue from labor, though labor is often blamed for it. A tiredness of wanting, rather, the specific exhaustion that comes from reaching, again and again, towards something just out of grasp, and finding the hand closing on air each time. On such afternoons, the desire to achieve something worthy of praise no longer feels like ambition. It feels instead like a weight carried up a long stair, one that never quite reaches the landing where it might finally be set down. There is no cruelty in this weight, and no one to blame for having placed it there. It simply accumulates, the way dust accumulates on a windowsill, unnoticed until the light falls at just the right angle to reveal how much has gathered. And it is on exactly such an afternoon, heavy with this particular dust, that the body turns, almost without deciding toward the door and beyond the door, toward whatever remains of the wild world still standing at the edge of town. Walking into nature on a day like this is not an escape, though it might look like one from the outside. It is closer to a kind of unburdening, the way a traveler might set down a heavy pack at the base of a hill before starting the climb. Not because the pack is no longer needed, but because it cannot be carried up the same slope that must now be faced without it. The mountains that rise beyond the last houses of the town do not ask what has been accomplished. They do not inquire after titles or recognitions, or the number of people who noticed a particular effort. They have been rising slowly, imperceptibly, for spans of time that make the whole of a single human ambition look like a spark struck once in the dark and gone before the eye can fully register it. Rivers cut through their bases with the same indifference, carrying silt from higher ground down toward a sea that will receive it without comment. Trees stand along the banks in numbers too large to count in a single glance. some of them older than any name currently spoken in any language, and none of them aware that this is remarkable. It is only remarkable to the one walking among them, the one who arrived heavy with a particular kind of dust and finds, somewhere between the second mile and the third, that the dust has begun very slightly to lift. There is a particular quality to the flowers that grow wild along mountain paths, unplanted, unarranged, appearing in clusters wherever the soil and light happen to agree with them. They do not compete for a place in anyone's garden, and they do not know that gardens exist at all. A person walking past one of these clusters might pause, might even crouch down to look more closely at the small architecture of a single petal. And in that pause, something quiet and important tends to happen. The flower does not perform for this attention. It simply continues being what it already was before the attention arrived, and will continue being it after the attention moves on. This is perhaps the first real lesson the mountain offers to the tired traveler, though it is rarely delivered all at once. It arrives instead in fragments, a flower here, a stretch of river there, a particular slant of afternoon light through a stand of birch, each fragment adding a small weight to the other side of the same old scale that had, until recently, been tipped so heavily toward wanting. Birds move through this landscape with an urgency that looks, at first glance, like the same striving found in human lives. But closer observation reveals something different entirely. The hawk circling above a valley is not accumulating anything. It circles because the air currents favor circling, and because somewhere below, movement in the grass has caught its attention, and the whole of its focus narrows to that single point, without any thought of what circling might mean for its reputation among other hawks. Insects move even more directly, driven by needs so immediate that the very concept of legacy would seem, if insects could consider such things, entirely beside the point. Fish rise and fall within a river's current, spending entire lives within a stretch of water that might measure only a few hundred meters from end to end, and yet nothing in their movement suggests any awareness of confinement. The animals larger than these, deer moving cautiously between clearings, foxes threading through underbrush, all carry the same quality noticed already in the forest beyond the valley, taking only what is needed, leaving the rest for whatever comes after. Walking among all of this activity, none of it aimed at recognitions, all of it aimed simply at continuing. A person begins to feel something loosen that had been tight for longer than could easily be remembered. It would be dishonest to suggest that this loosening arrives all at once, in a single dramatic moment of realization on some mountain overlook. More often it arrives the way morning arrives, gradually, so gradually that the exact point of transition from night to day cannot be identified even by some one watching closely for it. A person walks for an hour and still carries the old weight, walks for 2 hours and notices the weight has shifted slightly, resting now on a different part of the shoulder. By the 3rd hour, something has usually changed enough to be noticed directly, though what has changed is often difficult to name in the moment itself, and only becomes clear much later, in the quiet of an evening spent trying to write it down. The mountains, rivers, and trees that make up this landscape have existed, most of them, for spans of time that dwarf any single human life, by a margin too large to hold comfortably in the mind. A particular ridge might have stood in roughly its current shape, for tens of thousands of years, weathering storms and droughts, and the slow creep of forests advancing and retreating with the ice ages. As a particular river might have carried water along roughly its current path for a span of time long, enough to have outlasted every civilization currently existing on the earth several times over. And standing among all of this, a single human life with its 70 or 80 or 90 years begins to take on a different proportion than it holds in ordinary daily thinking. This is not a comfortable realization, and it would be false to claim otherwise. There is something in it that resembles smallness, and something that resembles fear. The particular fear of a mind confronting a scale it was never quite built to hold. But there is also, arriving almost simultaneously with the fear, something else entirely, something closer to relief, the same relief noticed before in the forest, in the fox who finally stops running and becomes part of the ground she once crossed. Because if a life is this brief against a backdrop this vast, then perhaps the weight carried up that long stairway, the wanting, the striving, the desire to leave proof that a particular arrangement of days amounted to something worth recording, was never quite as heavy or as urgent as it seemed on the afternoon it first appeared. Brevity, once truly felt rather than merely known as a fact, changes the texture of the hours that remain. It does not make those hours feel worthless, as a certain kind of despair might suggest. It makes them feel instead precious in a way that abundance never quite manages to produce. A single afternoon spent walking beside a river that has flowed in roughly the same path for 10,000 years becomes, suddenly, an afternoon worth noticing in full, rather than an afternoon to be endured on the way towards some later, more significant occasion. The mountain does not care whether it is noticed. The river does not require gratitude for its water. And yet gratitude arrives anyway, unbidden. The way warmth arrives when a hand is finally held close enough to a fire. Not because the fire demanded it, but because warmth is simply what happens when the right two things come close enough together. This gratitude, once it arrives, tends to settle differently than the wanting it replaces. Wanting always points forward, toward some future moment when enough will finally have been achieved, some horizon that recedes at exactly the pace it is approached. Gratitude, by contrast, points toward what is already present, the flower already blooming, the river already flowing, the brief and singular life already, somehow in progress. A person who has spent an afternoon walking among mountains that have stood for tens of thousands of years beside a river that has carried its water along the same worn path for just as long, surrounded by birds and insects and fish and animals that take only what they need and leave the rest for whatever comes after, returns home carrying something different than what was carried out that morning. The old desire has not vanished entirely. It rarely vanishes entirely for anyone, and there is no need to pretend it has, but it has been joined now by something quieter and sturdier, a willingness to live inside the brevity rather than fight against it, and to walk the short distance allotted with the same ungrudging completeness the flower brings to a single bloom, the same quiet acceptance the fox brings to the ground she eventually becomes. And so the walk ends as it always eventually must, at the edge of town where the wild landscape gives way again to streets and doors, and the ordinary business of a life still being lived, The mountains remain behind, indifferent and unchanged, exactly as they were before the visit, and exactly as they will be long after every person currently walking among them has become, in their own turn, soil for something else to grow from. This indifference is not coldness. It is instead the deepest form of welcome available, a landscape that asks nothing, judges nothing, and simply continues being itself regardless of who arrives to walk among it, or in what state of exhaustion they arrive. A life lived with this understanding does not become smaller for having glimpsed the scale against which it is measured. It becomes instead more fully itself, more willing to bloom without an audience, more willing to take only what is needed, more willing to walk the whole distance without complaint, and more able in the end to set the old weight down at the base of the mountain and walk the rest of the way up with hands gratefully emptied. The walk down takes less time than the walk up, as it always does, though something in the body insists on moving more slowly anyway, reluctant to leave the particular quality of attention found only on high ground. Streets appear again below, then rooftops, then the ordinary geometry of a town going about its evening business, lights coming on one by one in windows that have no idea what has just been carried down from the fountain behind them. There is no dramatic re-entry into this world, no threshold to cross that announces itself as a threshold. The door opens the same way it opened that morning, and closes behind in the same quiet manner. And for a moment it seems as though nothing at all has changed, as though the entire day among rivers and ridgelines might have been imagined rather than lived. But something has changed, even if it resists being named directly, and it tends to surface later, in the smaller hours, when the house has gone quiet and there is nothing left to distract from noticing it. A cup of water taken plainly at the kitchen sink tastes differently than it tasted that morning, though nothing about the water itself has changed in the slightest. The difference lies entirely in the hand holding the cup, and in whatever has shifted, however slightly, in the chest behind that hand. Evening arrives the way it always arrives, without asking permission, deepening first at the edges of the sky before claiming the whole of it. And there is a particular kind of stillness that settles over a room once the last of the daylight has finally gone. It is in this stillness that the day's walking tends to be replayed, not deliberately, not as an exercise in remembering, but the way a stone thrown into a pond continues sending ripples outward long after the stone itself has disappeared beneath the surface. The flower opens again behind closed eyes, unwitnessed as before. The fox passes again through her clearing, leaving the second hair untouched. The river bends again around its stone, patient as ever, indifferent to whether anyone is watching it bend. And somewhere beneath all of these returning images, a quieter question begins to surface, one that had been present all along, but only now finds enough silence to be properly heard. What exactly is being asked of a single life in a world that has already stood for hundreds of years before that life began, and will very likely continue standing for hundreds more after it has ended? This question does not arrive with an answer attached to it, and it would be dishonest to pretend that one arrives easily. But sitting with the question itself, rather than rushing past it towards some comforting conclusion, seems to matter more than answering it correctly. A world that predates a single life by centuries, and will outlast it by centuries more, is not on the surface an easy thing to feel at peace with. There is something almost vertiginous in trying to hold both truths at once. The truth of one's own days, so immediate and so real, pressed up against the truth of a world so much larger and so much longer than any single set of days could ever measure. And yet the vertigo sat with long enough tends to soften into something closer to steadiness. The way a person standing at the edge of a great height eventually stops trembling and simply looks, taking in the whole scale of the view without needing to control it. The mountain does not require an answer from the person standing at its base. It only requires a willingness to keep looking, and to let the looking itself become, gradually, its own kind of understanding. A house that has stood in one place for 100 years carries in its walls a particular kind of memory, though the memory is not stored in any language a person could read directly. It is stored instead in the way the floorboards have worn thin along a path from door to window, in the way a particular pane of glass has warped slightly with the passing decades, in the way the wood itself has darkened in places touched most often by human hands. None of this was recorded on purpose. No one stood in that house 100 years ago intending to leave a mark that would still be legible, and yet the mark remains anyway faint but real. It's evidence not of any single grand achievement, but simply of ordinary use, ordinary hands, ordinary days lived one after another without any particular ceremony attached to them. There is something quietly reassuring in this, a suggestion that a life does not need to aim at permanence. In order to leave some trace, the trace arrives on its own as a side effect of simply having lived. The way warmth arrives as a side effect of a fire that was never lit for the purpose of producing warmth in the first place, but only for the purpose of being a fire. The seasons turn in this part of the world with a regularity that has nothing to do with any single life passing through them. The spring arrives whether or not it is noticed, and autumn departs on its own schedule regardless of who is paying attention. A single human life might witness 70 or 80 or 90 of these turnings, as if it is fortunate enough to last that long, and each turning will look, in its broad outlines, remarkably similar to the one before it. The same trees will lose their lives in roughly the same weeks each year. The same rivers will swell with the same spring melt and settle again into the same familiar banks. By midsummer, there is a temptation, looking at this regularity, to feel small, to feel like one repetition among countless others, is indistinguishable from any that came before or any that will follow. But there is another way to look at the same regularity, one that does not shrink the life passing through it, but instead widens the frame around it, allowing that life to be seen not as a lonely event happening once and then vanishing, but as a single verse in a song that has been sung for longer than any single voice could ever sing. Is it alone, and will continue being sung by other voices long after this particular one has gone quiet. Choosing gratitude in the middle of all this scale and repetition, it is not the same as choosing denial. It does not require pretending that the smallness is not real, or that the brevity does not sting on certain nights more than on others. It requires only a willingness to let the smallness and the gratitude occupy the same chest at the same time without demanding that one of them cancel out the other. A life can be brief and still be enough. A life can be small against the scale of mountains and rivers and still matter entirely. In the same way, a single flower matters entirely to itself even while the whole valley around it remains utterly indifferent to its particular bloom. This is not a contradiction to be resolved. Oh, it is simply the shape of things. The same shape found in every lesson offered so far by fox and flower and stream. A shape that asks only to be accepted rather than solved. Morning arrives again, as it always does, indifferent to whatever was understood or misunderstood the evening before. There is a particular grace in this indifference, a kind of mercy hidden inside the ordinary turning of one day into the next. Yesterday's weight, whatever remained of it, does not have to be carried forward in its entirety. The stream does not carry yesterday's water forward either. It only carries what is passing through it now, releasing what has already passed downstream without regret and without any need to hold onto it. A person waking into a new morning is offered this same release, whether or not it is taken. The old wanting might still be there, waiting by the door the way an old habit waits. But the morning itself carries no obligation to answer it in the same way it was answered yesterday. There is always, on some level, a fresh chance to choose differently, to let the flower's example guide the day's first movements rather than the ledger's, to take only what closes the actual gap between hunger and its absence, and to leave the rest generously for whatever comes after. There is a particular hour just before full dark, when the sky holds onto the very last trace of blue, while the first stars begin to appear faint at first, then gradually more numerous as the darkness deepens around them. Standing beneath this hour, it becomes almost impossible not to think of scale again, though this time the scale in question dwarfs even the mountains that seemed so vast only a chapter or two ago. Each of those faint points of light has been traveling in most cases for spans of time that make the age of any mountain look almost recent by comparison. Some of the light arriving in a single glance upward left its source before the mountain itself had even begun to rise from whatever lower ground it started from. Standing beneath this, a single human life, already made to feel brief against rivers and ridgelines, it is made to feel briefer still, and yet the feeling that arrives is not despair. It is closer to the feeling of being held by something far larger than could ever be fully understood. The way an infant is held by an adult, whose full dimensions remain entirely beyond its comprehensio, then trusting the size of the thing holding it without needing to measure that size directly. Brevity, or looked at long enough under a sky like this, stops feeling like a wound and starts feeling instead like a kind of intimacy, a brief and irreplaceable participation in something too vast to be anything but held gently, remembered fondly, and released without struggle when its season finally comes to its natural close. A life, when it is finally laid out whole and viewed from some quiet distance, looks less like a monument and more like a single season in a very long forest. It's everything gathered so far, the flower opening without witness in its nameless valley, the fox taking only what closes the gap between hunger and its end, the stream finding its patient way around every stone too large to move, the mountains standing indifferent through spans of time no single mind can properly hold. All of it has been leading, quietly and without announcement, toward this one plain recognition. A life does not need to be recorded in order to have been complete. It only needs to have been lived the whole way through, bloom to fruit to seed to soil, without flinching from any part of that sequence. There was a longing once, to achieve something worthy of praise. And that longing has not been erased by any of this walking among rivers and ridgelines. It would be a kind of dishonesty to claim otherwise. And dishonesty was never the aim of any of this. The desire for proof that a particular arrangement of days amounted to something the world would boast. Though to keep that desire still visits, still knocks at certain hours, still sits at the edge of the bed on nights when sleep is slow to arrive. But something has shifted in how that visitor is received. It used to be let in and given the whole house, every room, every hour, and it used to be fed until it grew too large to fit back out the door it came in through. Now it is simply acknowledged, offered a seat by the window, and allowed to sit quietly while the rest of the evening continues without it running the household. This is, perhaps, the closest thing to wisdom that any of this walking has produced, and it arrives not as a triumph, but as something closer to a settling. The way silt settles at the bottom of a river after the current has calmed. Wanting even what is not needed has not vanished from the chest where it first took root. It has only been placed beside a second thing that grows more sturdily now than it once did. A willingness to notice what is already present rather than straining always toward what is still missing. The flower in the valley never had to choose between these two things, because it never carried the first one at all, but a life shaped by mirrors and ledgers, by the early lesson that being fed and held required first being seen. It cannot simply set that inheritance down in a single afternoon of walking, as it can only be held more loosely, day by day. The way a hot stone is held just long enough to feel its warmth before being returned to the ground, as it came from. There is comfort available in the brevity that once felt only like fear, and this comfort deserves to be named plainly before this particular telling comes to its close. 100 years standing as a ridge of stone, 1,000 years running as a river through a single worn path. These numbers were frightening at first glance, because they made a single human life look almost too small to matter. But smallness, looked at long enough, stops behaving like an insult and starts behaving instead like a kind of freedom. A flower that will bloom for only a handful of days does not spend those days negotiating with eternity. It spends them opening as fully as it can. Because opening fully is the only task available to something that knows, on some wordless level, how short its season truly is. The same freedom is available to a life that has finally stopped mistaking its own brevity for a woe. And knowing the days are few does not have to produce despair. It can produce instead a very particular kind of attention. The attention a person pays to a candle burning in a room with no other light, watching it not because it will last, but precisely because it will not. Gratitude, mentioned earlier as something that arrived unbidden on a mountain path, deserves one final word before this account is set down for good. It is not a mood that visits occasionally, on days set aside for appreciating things. It is closer to a posture, a way of standing in relation to the ordinary hours. That can be practiced the way a stream practices patience with the stones in its path, again and again, without any expectation of finally arriving at some permanent state of having learned it. Some mornings the old wanting still wins, and the whole day gets spent reaching for something that will not close the actual gap between hunger and its absence. Other mornings the gratitude arrives first quietly, before the wanting has even had the chance to wake up, and those mornings tend to feel, without any dramatic difference in their outward events, considerably lighter to carry. There is no permanent victory to report here, and no claim being made that the lesson has been learned once and for all. There is only the ongoing practice of noticing, the same practice offered by every flower, every fox, every patient bend of the river around stone, repeated for as long as there are days left in which to repeat it. It seems fitting now to return one final time to the valley where this whole account began, the one with no path lighting into it, the one where a single flower opened its petals to a morning no one was awake to witness. That flower has long since withered by now, if the account is honest about the passage of time. Its petals have browned and curled and fallen to the dark soil, and whatever came after, whether fruit or seed or simply the slow return of its substance to the ground that grew it, has already happened unwitnessed, exactly as its blooming was unwitnessed. And somewhere in that same valley, another flower has very likely opened in its place, this season or the next, indifferent to whether anyone remembers the one that came before it. This is not a sad ending, though it might sound like one when set down so plainly. It is instead the entire shape of the lesson this valley had to offer from the very first sentence of this telling, delivered now with as much clarity as it can be given. Continuation does not require memory. Completeness does not require an audience. A life fully lived, fully opened, fully given over to whatever season it was allotted, does not become incomplete simply because the world moves on without recording that it happened. What remains then, after all this walking among rivers and ridgelines, is after all this watching of foxes and flowers, and the patient work of water against stone, it is something far less dramatic than a resolution and far more useful than one. There is simply a willingness, renewed each morning as needed, and to live the short distance allotted with something closer to the flower's ungrudging fullness than to the old hunger for proof and permanence. The mountains will remain standing long after this particular willingness has returned, in its own turn, to soil. The rivers will carry on finding their way around whatever stones the future places in their path, and whatever brief season is left to walk through, whatever handful of days remain in which to bloom, wither, bear fruit, and pass life on, can be walked now with a little less weight on the shoulder, and a little more gratitude in the hands that were, for so long, reaching for something that was never actually required. Thank you for spending these moments with this channel. As if these words brought a little more peace into your day, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more quiet reflections. Until next time, take care of your heart.